Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are, what time you are listening to this. My name is Winston, and this is another episode of the Revenue Alignment Podcast. I am your host, and today we have a very special guest with us, a Miss MJ Peters. MJ, it's good having you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Winston. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for jumping back on. I mean, first time on the Revenue Alignment Podcast, but actually, this is our second or maybe third podcast together. So you're no stranger here.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I've gotten better at the whole podcast guesting since the.
Right. So, guys, I mean, really and truly, MJ needs no introduction. But for those of you who may not know who she is, MJ has held several positions, marketing leader positions throughout her career. Being a product and marketing manager, and move on to become the director of marketing and VP of marketing at Firetrace International. And currently she's the VP of growth at Refine Labs. So MJ, before we even get into any sort of question in our conversation, why don't you just tell us about your history? Because I'm certain there are certain things I missed out in that.
Yeah. So I know we're going to be talking about business acumen and marketing today. So let me tell you a little bit about my background just through that lens. I graduated university and I went straight into a rotational development program with a company called Halma. So this is a global manufacturing conglomerate that owns about 50 to 60 small to medium-sized businesses around the world. And the program lets you rotate through different parts of the business in 6-month rotations, and you work on projects. So first 6 months out of school, I was a manufacturing engineer. And then I went through marketing, product development, and product management, finally landed in that position you mentioned, manager of product and marketing, where I was basically a one-woman team doing product management and marketing. Product management is great for building business acumen because you basically are the CEO of the product line. That's how a lot of people describe it. Got my first chance to join a leadership team coming over to Firetrace. So there I built the marketing team from 2 to 5 and was a member of the board of directors, eventually getting promoted up to VP. That was great, again, for business acumen because I was exposed to how the leadership team was making decisions, learned a lot about finance, which we can get into. And then most recently came over to Refine Labs, where I lead right now product marketing and sales. So this has been a busy week for me. I'm onboarding our first director of sales here at Refine Labs.
Oh, awesome. And let's just go back to your previous two, where you mentioned being a board member. Talk to us about that experience because that was very interesting. I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So some of the people listening to this might be familiar with like the software as a service board model. And typically in a SaaS company, your board is like filled with people from the venture capital firm and your investors, and then maybe the CEO and maybe the COO and the CFO are on the board. But inside of these Halma companies, really anyone that is a VP or leading a department is on the board of directors, and we only had 1 or 2 people that were not executive members of the board of directors, which means executive traditionally means they work at the company, right? And then you have non-executive members who work at other companies but are on the board. So the only 2 non-executive board members would be somebody from another company within the Halma group that was there to provide an outside perspective, and then usually the president's boss, so some kind of like divisional exec. So that's the board model. And so I was, as the leader of marketing there, a member of the board of directors.
Okay, and what was like, probably you can help us understand what were some of the conversations that happened in those meetings, because one of the things I found, and we'll get into that later on, is that marketers have a very narrow point of view, not necessarily because they necessarily want to, but because they can only see things through a marketing lens. So probably help us understand like what were some of the conversations that were happening in those boardrooms as it relates to marketing's value to the organization or contribution to the organization.
Yeah, so when I joined Firetrace, one of the top priorities of, well, there was really two top priorities of the CEO. We were right in the middle of really turning around manufacturing operations, getting a hold of our supply chain, making sure we could ship things out on time, making sure we were hiring the right people into our technician roles and retaining people. So that needed a lot of work. So he was really involved in that day to day. But actually, the CEO of Halma being a $10 billion market cap company, told him, hey, I know you're turning around operations right now, but don't wait to think about growth.
Right.
Because if you wait to think about growth, one day you'll wake up and it'll be too late. You should have started thinking about growth. You will wish that you started thinking about growth 18 months ago. So he thought about that, and he started to first think about marketing, which is interesting because I don't think all CEOs would think that way. They'd be like, growth, I need to hire more salespeople.
Right.
When he first thought about marketing, that I think speaks to CEO understanding the value of marketing. And he said, all right, well, first things first, marketing needs to figure out who is our ideal customer, which
Right.
segments do we need to be focusing on. And he knew that I had experience doing that, which is really why he brought me in. So at the board level, the early discussions were, we've been doing some customer research. This is where we think customers see value in our product. Some people in some industries see more value than others. How is this going to impact our go-to-market strategy? Where do we geographically have salespeople in the world? How do we talk about our products? What needs to be on our product roadmap? So marketing was heavily involved in all of those things.
Okay. So yeah, great. So what about I wasn't even going to go there, but since you brought it up, what about those marketers who may work for a CEO who doesn't get marketing? What do you recommend they do? I mean, I know I'm not sure if this is the entire culture or thought process of everyone at Refine Labs. I know it is for Chris, where he mentions don't work for a CEO who doesn't get marketing. What's your take on that in terms of how can marketers strike that balance between um not working for a CEO or not being a part of a company that doesn't value marketing, but at the same time, marketers still need to be held accountable for results such as revenue and so on, business outcomes.
Yeah, I think I'm a little more forgiving than Chris on this point. I don't think it's black and white, right? I don't think you either get marketing or you don't get marketing. I think it's more of a 2x2, right? So you've got on one axis you have, does the CEO get marketing or do they not get marketing? But then on the other axis you have, what is the size of the CEO's ego? So
Okay.
and why I think that's important is because you could have a CEO who, quote unquote, doesn't get marketing, but they're a low ego person, right? They're
Right,
open
right.
minded. And you can work with that person. And actually, I think some marketers, I would probably count myself among them, can really thrive in a situation where the CEO doesn't know a ton about marketing, but they trust you, they respect you, and they're willing to learn from you. And you can make a huge impact in those kind of companies. Where you don't want to get into is CEO doesn't get marketing and they have a huge ego, because you're never going to change that situation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. So what about the ones who they have a low ego and they're open? Like what can marketers do to really prove? Because you mentioned about that respect, that trust, but it's not something, at least I believe, a CEO is just going to give to you just because you say, hey, trust me with this budget. And we'll see what happens. So what can marketers do, or what should they be focusing on to really earn that trust and that respect from the CEO?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is to figure out what is important to them and to deliver on that in your first 90 days. So
Mm,
um, I knew, so objectively, when I started at Firetrace, that was a CEO who did get marketing, so I was in a good situation. But there's a lot of different aspects to marketing, right? And what you as the marketing leader might see as the number one priority may not be what the CEO sees as the number one priority. So I knew that the CEO saw this customer research and segmentation effort, just truly understanding our customers and why they buy from us, And there was a caveat in there because we sold through distribution. So our
Right.
company was not very close to the end user. And ultimately, distributors buy stuff from you because they can sell it to someone else. Like, that's it. That's the value prop. So we needed to understand the value prop of the end user. So that was his number one priority. I was super bullish on digital marketing because so many manufacturing companies don't do any digital marketing. The landscape is wide open and there's so much low-hanging fruit. But I knew that in order to gain the CEO's trust, I needed to deliver on his number one objective, that customer research, in my first 90 days. So I started there. I delivered clear results. That, he saw that and he said, all right, she's doing what I brought her in to do. And then I started bringing other ideas to the table. Hey, we need to redesign our website. It's on like PHP from 2004. We need to implement a real CRM system, right? And we did all of those things, but only after there was clear traction in the area he cared about most.
Yeah, I haven't even heard the term PHP in a while. That's been a while,
That's how
and
you know.
you kind of touched on a question I was going to ask later on in the podcast, but since you brought it up, in terms of those first 90 days, like I don't know if you have like a set process that you follow or just like on a high level things that you can mention. Like what do you recommend? Let's say it's a brand new marketing hire. They just started day one. What can they do those first 90 days to truly show the value of marketing's impact to the organization?
Yeah, it's funny because if you're interviewing for a marketing leadership position, people will ask you that question. And that question is kind of weird to me because it inherently favors people who have like a playbook that they're going to come in and implement. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the right thing to do, right? Like, you need to get in there and diagnose the situation before prescribing your playbook.
Right.
I had an inkling based on the interview process that this company was going to need the customer research stuff, right? So you can do your due diligence. What is the CEO's number one priority? I knew it was customer research. So I came in and my first objective was I need to diagnose why this is not happening already.
Right.
So he brought me in because it wasn't happening. What's the root cause? And so I diagnosed the root cause as people don't know how to do customer research. So you ask people to go out and do customer research and they don't do it because they don't even know what that means, right? Or why you should do it. And so that was like a training issue. People needed the skills. And it was also a little bit of a culture issue as well. There was not a culture of customer research and market research in this organization. So I diagnosed the root problem and I moved quickly to correct that. And so what I prescribed then, once I diagnosed the problem, was I brought in this consultant, which was smart because I didn't realize how smart it was at the time. But he specializes, right, in training people on customer research and also in kicking off these sort of culture changes. So
Right.
I think people underestimate the value when you're in a culture change situation of bringing in someone with the right energy level at the beginning. This guy's high energy. He's great. To really kickstart and get momentum there. And so I really, like, if you're in this situation, you've got two options. You can go bring in a consultant who does this 24/7, 365, right? And they're going to be really good at it and they're going to do it faster than you. Or like, hey, I've got the skills to do this. I could design my own training program. And I'm really glad I went with the former because it got us going a lot faster. It was a lot less work for me. And honestly, it was worth every penny. So we did that training. And then from there, it was about holding people accountable to implementing those skills that I had brought the consultant in to train them on.
Right. Which is when there's so much or so many follow-up questions. I haven't even gotten to the actual questions I want to ask you just yet. This is so good. In terms of customer research, because I'm someone as well who believes heavily in it. As a matter of fact, I can't see myself implementing or prescribing any sort of marketing strategy, tactic, execution unless I've spoken to a handful of customers at least. But I know there are organizations where I don't know if it's a policy thing, if it's red tape, if it's culture, that marketers aren't allowed to do that customer research. They're like, hey, only the sales team or only the customer success team speaks to customers. What can marketers do in that situation? Whether it's how can they get the buy-in for marketing to the customer research or doing a culture change, or how can they maneuver and navigate around that?
Yeah, number one, the last time I was considering switching jobs, ended up coming to Refine Labs. I had one other offer on the table. And first of all, Chris and Megan are fantastic. So there's a gravitational pull towards Refine Labs. But the other reason that I didn't take that other job is because I interviewed with the sales director and he was very hesitant about marketing, talking to customers. And it came out in our conversation. So I was like, bit of a red flag there. So
Yeah.
that's one. Talk about that when you're interviewing. However, number two is if the organization is not completely stonewalling you, but they're a little bit hesitant, and the sales team isn't making those intros easy for you, you just need to do the work and actually go out and set up conversations with people that aren't customers, but they're ICP.
Okay. Yeah.
It's actually a lot easier, I would say, in a manufacturing organization, because a lot of manufacturing organizations don't have SDR teams. They don't do a lot of cold calling. So if you as a marketer are going to go reach out cold to people that are ideal customers, but they aren't buying from you yet, it's not like that person's already been called 6 times by an SDR. Like this is the first time they're hearing from you, probably.
Yeah.
You have to do a lot of outreach, right, to get people, because especially non-customers, they don't feel affinity to your organization, so they're not necessarily going to give you their time. But some people will say yes, and some people just want to help. They want to be helpful, and they like talking about what they do if they're an expert, right? So some people will say yes to this. You interview those people, and it's crazy because sometimes actually in the course of the interview, the person by the end of the interview wants to buy something from you, even though you're not even selling anything. When that happens, then the sales team's like, whoa, marketing can talk to customers whenever they want.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just piggybacking on that, getting to the root of this conversation now. I remember you made a post, which was a great post, by the way, where you mentioned about doing cold calling, and that helped with your messaging. With some work you were doing at Refine Labs, and I thought that was brilliant. Talk to us in terms of what are some of the lessons and your experiences with doing sales now, because I'm assuming that you're doing a lot more sales probably than you've ever had in your career. um how does that shift, or how did that shift really help you become better as a marketer, having
Yeah.
that getting that sales experience?
I'm incredibly fortunate at Refine Labs. I don't have to actually cold call anybody. We have 100% of our pipeline is inbound, so that's nice. Customers just book time with me, which is great. But it's been a very interesting experience for me in my career to do sales, because you realize that sales is on the hook not just for delivering the messaging, right? Really, in marketing, you deliver the messaging you in whatever format, right? Whether it's a homepage or a piece of content, and usually you don't have to answer questions, handle objections, all of these things, especially not live in person with very little time to think, right? So what sales inherits is oftentimes marketing messaging that is not fully baked, and they just have to make up for the difference. And so now that I'm in the hot seat, it's like, oh my God, whenever we launch new messaging, I have to flight this, right? And I have to handle the objections. And if it doesn't land, I'm going to have to be the one that pivots and saves the conversation, right? It's a lot of pressure. So it has given me a lot more empathy for sales, especially from a product marketing perspective of you need to do a lot more work as a marketer to give sales some really concrete training. How do you handle objections? How do we clarify this? Because if there's any gaps in the messaging at all, sales is going to have to improvise to fill those gaps. And if gaps if they improvise too much, they're just going to fall back on their old pitch because they know it and it's worked for them in the past. So if you really want new messaging to stick, I in the future will work a lot harder than I have in the past in product marketing, handing off to sales.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that probably where marketing and sales alignment is concerned, it has given you a better perspective on how to do that, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's given me a better perspective on really what sales deals with day to day. And it's interesting too from the sales side of the table because I have previously been in marketing. I don't write things off as easily as I think maybe a lot of salespeople would, right? Like when there's new messaging, Chris and I work on it together, and sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to implement this new messaging. It's like I'm just going to blow up my whole pipeline. This is just terrible. But then I think back to when I was a marketing leader. I mean, I still am the marketing leader here too, but when I was solely a marketing leader,
Yeah.
not in charge of sales, and I was so frustrated that sales would never even try to implement my messaging. And I'm like, okay, I have to at least give it a try. So I have empathy from both sides of the table now.
And what do you recommend for marketers to do to one to have that same level of empathy? Because I've I found that it's true even with myself. Like my sales background makes me a bit more empathetic and understanding towards some of the things that sales go through. What do you recommend marketers do from their end in terms of how to better achieve marketing and sales alignment?
Yeah, I mean, join sales calls for sure. And then if you find yourself in a situation where you are launching a new product or you are trying to break into a new segment, whether that's the enterprise segment from mid-market, the SMB segment from enterprise, or like a specific industry vertical, actually, I think product marketing should sell the first couple of deals themselves. And I used to do that when I was a product marketer, product manager in manufacturing. Like if we were launching a completely new product or we were developing prototypes for a new product, I would lead the calls with prospective customers to understand what their pain points were. And often through that customer development process at the end, I would actually get the PO. I would get the purchase order.
Right.
And so, if you are in a situation where you're launching something new and you have the ability to actually close the deal yourself, it's such great practice, and it helps you really hand it off to sales and give them something that they can run with and scale.
Yeah, because now you have that practical experience rather than just theoretically what you think might work.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's not practical for everyone in every role, but seek out those experiences if they become available to you for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're the eighth guest I've interviewed. I've interviewed seven other people, and it's so funny. Probably one or two of them fall within marketing, but most of them aren't. So whether they fall in operations. I interviewed Megan just the other day, so that's customer success, finance, sales. And the common theme that I've realized with literally every single guest I've interviewed is that starting how we pretty much started this podcast around marketing, having that very fixed, narrow point of view where they can only see marketing and nothing else. They lack that organizational perspective on a high level that would really make them better marketing leaders. First of all, why do you think that is, and what do you believe they can do to really develop that mindset and that acumen?
Yeah. I think part of it is because there's so many things that you could do in marketing that one of the most important things you can do as a marketing leader is figure out what the one or two or three things that you should go all in on are, right? So at Refine Labs, LinkedIn and the podcast generate like 90% of our business. Between LinkedIn podcast and then the word of mouth that gets generated because of the LinkedIn and the podcast, that's almost 100% of our business. And so we go all in on that, right? But Chris figured that out early on in the company, right? Because we could have focused on kind of outbound sales inside of communities like Pavilion, right? We could have focused on SEO. We could have done outbound cold calling. I think he even tried a little bit of that at the beginning, right? And so if you don't have an understanding of what's going on in the rest of the business, like product, right? What are the key things that your product does best and why are those important to customers? Customer success, what kind of customers are churning versus what kind of customers are your best fit customers that are super happy? Finance, which segments of your business are the most profitable? Where would it be the smartest for you to grow? Then it's really hard to narrow down all the options and where you can double down in marketing. So that's why I think business acumen is extremely important.
Yeah. And just staying on that same point, you made a post around your career trajectory over the next 10 years, and you were saying these are probably 3 or 5 skills or experiences that you develop based on what your goals are. So within the context of marketing actually getting a seat at that strategic table, whether it's at a board level or it's one level below board, what are the 3 to 5 skills do you believe they should develop over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years to really be able to have that seat at the strategic table, the leadership table?
Yeah. So think about the context of this post was think about where you want to be in 3 to 5 years or 10 years, whatever time horizon you choose. And what are the skills you don't have today that you need in order to get there? And then write them down. And writing them down is very important because it really forces you to think about it in a way that it goes beyond the surface level. So when I did this list about 5 years ago, my long-term goal was actually to be a founder of a company. And so at that time, I was kind of an individual contributor, kind of a manager. I had like one direct report. So I was like, I definitely need to lead a team that's bigger than one person, right?
Yeah.
I was very fascinated by startups, and a lot of startups are in the software space, so I wanted to work on a software product. I could see the president of my company at that time making decisions about where we should invest at the company level, not just at marketing. So I talked about how there's many different things you could do in marketing. If you're the CEO of a company, there's even infinitely more things you could do, right? Because now you're not just choosing between SEO and a podcast, you're choosing between building a robot, fixing the supply chain, and acquiring a small business down the street. It's like, whoa, how do I prioritize that? And I had no inkling of how he was doing that. So I was like, I'd like to gain the perspective that allows me to do that, and so that I would be confident making those kinds of decisions. And people just talk about the P&L all the time. And I remember when people used to talk about the P&L before I understood a P&L and before I understood finance, and I was like, man, I don't understand this. It's just a bunch of numbers. It's accounting, taxes, whatever. Why does this matter? But I was like, I feel like it matters, so I should probably learn thing. So those were the things on my list. And between now and then, I've checked almost all of those boxes. And I'm now in a leadership position. And reflecting back on that, the team leadership thing is huge. And the business decision-making piece of it is huge, especially if you want a seat at the table. And I think that the understanding of a P&L is sort of inextricably linked to being able to make those business decisions, because finance really tells the story of your business to your shareholders.
Yeah, that's very true. Because I mean, even myself, it's one of the things I've over the last couple of weeks, probably 2, 3 months now, intentionally, gone on YouTube just to watch videos around how to read financial statement. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean for the impact of the company? Because I'm trying to figure out, and a part of this podcast is a part of that as well. Why I decided to do it. Like, how do you make that link between marketing and financial statements? Like, what marketing activities directly impact a financial statement, so that when marketers, as a marketer, you're going to the CFO or the CEO to say, hey, we need an increase in budget on this specific thing, then you know exactly what numbers or what data they care about and what to pay attention to, that, what growth levels you need to pull in order to make that happen.
Yeah, well, and that should be also a two-way conversation. I don't think people talk about this enough, but when I was at Firechase, we completely transformed how we did financial reporting. Specifically, we segmented out our P&L, right? So we looked at how profitable is the wind turbine segment of our business versus military segment of our business versus the machine shop segment of our business. And the finance team wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't meet with them extensively and say, first of all, the 3 segments that matter are wind turbines, military, and machining, right? And these are the products in our ERP system that get sold to each of these segments, because finance doesn't usually talk to customers. Finance is a back office function, right? So they wouldn't have the knowledge to be able to figure out what data goes in what column, right? They do have the financial knowledge about building a P&L,
right,
but they don't know which product we sell to wind versus machining, right? So if you can make that a two-way conversation, you can actually, as a marketer, help finance understand how to really contextualize those financial reports, which makes them way more valuable for both sides. So definitely make that a two-way conversation if you can.
Yeah, that's a good point. Have you ever been in a situation where throughout your marketing career, you've had to gone to whether it's CEO, CFO, whoever for an increase in marketing budget? And if so, how did you make that happen? How did you get that buy-in for that increase?
Yeah, I got a 30% increase in my budget after like about 15 months working at Firetrace, I think. And it was just about contextualizing it in terms of the strategy. Hey, this is what we did this year in order to grow this segment. You can see the revenue coming through now. I'd like to make these moves next year to grow further in this segment, and therefore I proposed this budget. And I didn't get any pushback.
It's no, because that's such a great point. How can I put this? The first thing that jumped out at me that you said was that you're focused on revenue. Like, how can we, or should I say, these are the areas that's contributing to revenue. So let's focus on that. I know Chris had mentioned this once, but I don't think it's spoken about enough because often we'll hear marketers talk about brand marketing. Oh, you need to build a brand. You need to build a brand. And I'm saying, yes, that's true. Branding is a good long-term strategy, but what are the things you need to focus on, like in the short term, that those revenue generating activities that makes, builds that trust and that respect that we spoke about earlier with your CEO? Like, you need to focus on those things as well.
Yeah, I mean, one conversation that specifically happened was like, the budget is only so big, right? If you invest in marketing, you can't invest somewhere else. So
Yeah.
sometimes, actually, as a marketing leader, you should be clear about the fact that maybe the investment in marketing is not the best investment for the business, right? And you should think like a CEO that way, right? Like just
Wait,
be like,
MJ,
hey,
MJ, stop. Which marketer is going to admit that an investment in marketing is not the best thing right now?
a marketer who understands that there are other areas of the business that might actually return more revenue, right? Like, as an example, right? Let's say you have two options. You can increase your digital marketing budget, or you can hire a couple of engineers to develop a new product that will, open up a new customer segment for you, right?
Right.
You need to look at that in terms of like, all right, let's say my digital marketing investment can help us grow revenue 25% next year. But this new product line, if we can get it off the ground, will help us grow revenue 80% over the next 4 years. And that's how the CEO's thinking, right? This or that. It's not like, is it good to invest in marketing so we can grow revenue 25% or not? Like, that is good. Growing revenue 25% is good. But
Yeah.
growing revenue 25% at the expense of growing revenue somewhere else 80% is not good.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think we spoke about a good amount here. Definitely appreciate you coming on. Any closing thoughts that you have, just like advice around the whole aspect of how marketers can prove their value at a C-suite level, that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to this podcast, probably a lot of people are like, a lot of these things that I've done or talked about, right? They require you to be sitting in a leadership seat in a company. Like,
Right.
the reason I have all this visibility into the P&L, the reason I can get the VP of Finance to change how they're doing reporting is because I am their peer and we sit in the board meetings together. And so I just want to acknowledge that, right? Like, I have gained a ton of valuable cross-functional business experience by being in a leadership seat, which isn't, the easiest thing to accomplish, right? And maybe not a short-term solution for a lot of people. So given that, I would say one easy step that a lot of people can take is listening to more business podcasts. So this podcast is a good example, right? But podcast with stories about founders who built businesses, right? What were they thinking about and when? And that'll give you a lot of context for, again, how does the CEO or the person with the largest number of levers that they could pull in the business spend their time and prioritize things. And you'll find out by listening to these stories. How I Built This is a great podcast with business stories. you'll find out like, hey, a lot of the time the CEO is thinking about supply chain, or they're thinking about finance, or they're thinking about cash burn, and sometimes they're thinking about marketing. But like, when are they thinking about marketing versus when are they thinking about other things? And it'll give you a lot more empathy for the CEO. It's easy to do, right? You just swap out your regular marketing podcast with a couple of business episodes here and there.
Awesome. Great tips, MJ. Great points. Thank you again so much. If people need to find you, where can they go?
Yeah, I am most active on LinkedIn. So I am just MJ Peters on LinkedIn, or /MJ Peters1. And I accept all connections, unless you're going to try to sell me something.
MJ, such a pleasure having you on. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Winston.
This has been the Revenue Alignment Podcast. Join us next week where we have more amazing content to help you demonstrate, communicate, and prove your value at the C-suite level. I'm Winston, your host, and this is a wrap.